And welcome to those of you who have since joined. All right. So the goal of this Lunch and Learn series is to create learning opportunities on relevant real estate development topics. And our goal here is to put more entities in the position to own and control real estate. It's to help understand the roles of the people that you will need to hire to get you through all the stages of the development process and to really be a more active participant. We may not be able to get you to the level of expertise to take this on all yourself, but we really want folks to have an active seat at the table and be able to collaborate with various partners that they're working with on these projects and be equipped to be in more of a position of power in these conversations. We want to be able to answer questions that you have about the real estate development process. So we really encourage you throughout this conversation to unmute yourself and chime in with questions, or you can also feel free to put questions in the chat if you have them. And we also want you to be able to connect with and learn from each other. So we welcome you to chime in with your own experiences, as well as reach out to other folks you see on this Zoom in the chat, and feel free to connect. Kristen Ryan is probably a familiar face to most of you by now. She's a partner in Barry & Ryan, which is a multifamily and civic project developer who has done a ton of different projects around the Seattle area. And I will let both of you share a little bit more about yourselves when I hand it back to you. And our guest speaker today is Darren Medina. He has a lot of experience with design and development of retail and restaurant spaces, such as Mod Pizza, Starbucks, Whole Foods, a lot of different companies. And we have recently been working with Darren on our commercial affordability pilot program, also funded through COO. And Darren has provided direct support to small business owners that are undergoing their own real estate development projects. So he comes with a ton of experience that we think will provide for a very fruitful conversation today. So today, Darren will share some of his experiences working with organizations to design their interior spaces in order to meet their program needs. He's going to talk a little bit about the development process and different roles. He'll talk about how you can determine when it will be useful to bring in an architect or a general contractor. He'll talk a little bit about selecting the right partners for your projects, as well as some tips on understanding local zoning and permitting requirements before you commit to a site or a building. And we'll have time for questions and answers throughout, as well as at the end. So thank you so much for joining us, and I will now hand it to Kristen and Darren.
Thanks. Welcome, everybody. Nice to see everybody, many familiar faces. You know, as we've spoken about through many of our past presentations or our real estate development classes, we've recently been talking about some of the partnerships that occur if spaces that the groups here are looking at creating and developing end up in a partnership with another developer who's creating housing above, or what's happening in another part of a building. And so I think what's exciting about today's conversation is another piece has been to say, hey, let's talk to people really doing this. Darren's experience in building out stores and ground level spaces and interactive spaces within community is more than extensive. I'm going to let him share some of the highlights of that with you. But I think it gives a really great, we'll have a really great conversation today about what happens and what are some of the things to be thinking about as you go through that process. So Darren, you want to share with this group a little bit that goes beyond the slide that Melissa shared and some of the fun things you've had the chance to do in your career?
Yeah, so thank you everyone for attending here. So my background, my training, my degree is actually in architecture, but my career has really been focused on restaurant and retail design. And I would say really what kind of directed my path was getting hired and being moved up here to Seattle by a company that at the time I had never heard of. It's called Starbucks. But what that experience gave to me was just an exposure to so much more than just design. It was like an education in, business and real estate and development and operations. And so I've been able to utilize that experience with other companies that I've worked with throughout the years. Again, not just Starbucks, but Mod Pizza, Whole Foods, Lululemon. So just kind of a variety, and also Fair Start, which is actually the organization that got me into working with communities, really. So that was kind of a great launch for me. And I did that actually while taking a year off from Starbucks. So.
Very cool. Well, I think that the two real categories that we'll talk through today, one is kind of what is the process of going through a store build out, and the other is, really, I think, speaking to what is the experience that, Darren, you can share of some of the unique things that occur in that relationship that you have as the architect or the designer or the handholder, lots of different roles with the group, the organization, the store that is trying to have that space become, their home. And so do you want to start with, would you like to start with the process a little bit, or do you want to before we get into some of the specifics with, I know you have some great examples to share that we can talk about kind of as case studies.
Yeah, I guess before we jump into the process, I guess what really prompted me to kind of put this together from a process standpoint was the work that we've done most recently with NDC, helping these small businesses. And in that, really seeing that the need was just for a high level understanding of what the process is, so that the small business owners can really feel like they're more engaged in the process, but also more empowered during the whole thing. And so, what I've been able to provide is technical assistance, which is just a very generic term, but it's been a wide variety of things. Again, I've been fortunate because I've had a lot of experience at this, but just to give you some examples of what that has looked like with these small businesses, we helped a restaurant owner kind of get back into their community in the Central District. But we kind of jumped into that process during construction. And so what we did is to really identify what are the needs that still exist that haven't been taken on. And we kind of took those on. So it ranged from, equipment planning, sourcing, getting permits from the health department, getting signage designed and fabricated and installed. So it's little things along the way, but ultimately, if those things weren't taken care of, it would definitely have an impact on the success and actually the eventual opening of that business. So again, I think through that process, not just with that business, but with some of the other ones that we've helped, it really showed the need to understand the process, right? So that's why I wanted to kind of walk through what I'm calling the store development process in this. And, I call it store development, but it relates to the development process as a whole. There's, maybe some nuance in there with other types of projects, but I think overall, just generally, it's pretty similar. So if we can kind of just jump into what that process is with the next slide, that'd be great.
And I think to your point is kind of extrapolated to any space. There are elements of it. Some of them will be specific to kind of a restaurant or food use, but others that are generally enough that really relate to any space that's going sort of within another building that either is already built and has this space available to be leased, or is under construction with this space, under development or in thoughts about it, how it's going to be developed. And so I think, Darren, you can speak to that as we go through this too.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so this is very high level what that process looks like. There's a lot of different roles and responsibilities, different people that take on certain things. But just to kind of walk you through, there's the pre-design and programming stage. And that's before you even have a site selected a lot of times. But it's really understanding what the goals are of your project and your business, what you're trying to achieve. And then there's actually selecting the site. There's site survey of understanding, what the actual conditions of the site are. And then there's the design, conceptual design, developing a store plan, schematic design, which leads into construction documents, permitting after that, and then construction. And then for whether it's a retail store or a restaurant, there could be training, and then store opening. So I'll go into a little bit more detail on each of these, but again, that's just kind of what all the steps are. So the next slide talks a little bit about, again, pre-design and programming. And this is really where the business owner needs to establish what the project goals are. And those goals eventually translate into what you are looking for from a real estate standpoint, and what your needs are. So I think it's helpful. I think some people just like jumping into kind of looking for a site or even designing something. But this pre-design and programming is really critical because it gets everyone on board with what the project goals are, what you're trying to achieve, and then eventually how you're going to achieve those things. And again, it definitely impacts what you should be looking for from a real estate standpoint.
And Darren, can you describe, and maybe, something like your Starbucks experience is relevant in there, but like, who are the parties that tend to influence that input? Did Starbucks do customer surveys that drove what stores looked like? Did it all come out of the baristas? Like, who are the parties that have important input to give into some of this programming and design element?
Yeah, there's definitely, depending on the organization, there's different stakeholders. And some people have influence, and some people have decision rights. So not everyone necessarily is created equal in that process, but I think it is important to really be as inclusive as possible. So from Starbucks, I always talk about Starbucks really as an operational driven company. So, and for me, again, that's one of the things that I really learned being at Starbucks was design is just kind of the tail end of the process. Because if things don't work operationally, whether it's from the operator themselves or from the customer standpoint, then it doesn't really matter how things look, right? So everything I do in terms of design is really approached from an operator's standpoint. So there's the operators, like with Starbucks, it's operators, it's marketing, it's category managers, different products that they're trying to sell. There are sometimes, customer surveys, or sometimes surveys with the baristas in the stores. So it all kind of depends on the project itself. But again, to be as inclusive as possible and really look at what are you trying to achieve for the end user? Because you may not be the end user. Someone out there will be the end user, and you're trying to understand what is it that they want out of this project or space. So,
and I assume your experience as an architect, while that training was sort of around design, the more operational knowledge you had for the specific element you were trying to introduce into that space, the better you could perform for clients in that, right? If you don't understand restaurants and you're an architect that builds houses to come in and support that, you're missing some of the experience and the natural questions to ask.
Right. And actually, one of the examples that I'll show later is specific to designing the back of house of a restaurant. And you don't, as an architect, that's not what you're trained in necessarily. So again, kind of bringing in that experience from, I've actually worked in restaurants too. So there's a lot of different experiences that I've been able to bring into the design, but also, even if you don't know how something operates, I think it's important to understand what are the right questions to ask and have the operator walk you through that process. And that's what, again, the example I'll show later it informed me on, how this operates and then how we can make it better, essentially. So now jumping back in, there's site tour and site selection. So with Starbucks, we work with brokers across the country, and we had, different landlords that we would work with, some, more often than others. But we were always looking for, again, what is the site that's going to accommodate the program and the goals? So I kind of jumping back again to the programming. It's know what it is that you're looking for before you start looking, right? And then the site survey is something that typically an architect takes on. And sometimes you can decide on a site before a site survey is done. But other times it's pretty important to have an architect do a site survey so you really understand what the conditions of the site are that are potentially going to impact the scope and the budget of your project. We've run into that multiple times with the different companies that I've worked for, where we took on a site as is, and then as we did the site survey, uncovered a lot of different issues that we didn't realize we had to pay for. So if there is concern, right, about what that site really is, then I think a site survey, you'll be spending something up front, but in the long run, it could be very well worth it from a cost standpoint. Okay. Then the next step is developing a concept. And then a store plan. And this is just, how the actual space lays out. As much as you're looking for that ideal site, you're not necessarily going to get everything you want. And certain things may dictate where you can put things. So you might have an idea in your head about how you want everything to lay out, but the site is really going to dictate what that looks like. From a layout standpoint. Then the concept itself is more about like, how does it look? How does it appear to everyone? And then that kind of jumps into the schematic design part of it.
And Darren, are there times when, a site's been selected and it seems to make sense, but then you go to try to lay out a program in it and you just can't make it work and you have to move on? I mean, does that happen?
Yeah, well, there's examples with, and I won't say which companies, I probably can pull examples from a couple companies, but, I'll give an example of drive-through for certain restaurants is a big deal. And, just because the space is an existing drive-through doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to fit your specific programmatic needs. And so we've taken sites, I say we, not me, but these companies have taken sites that were drive-throughs, assuming that we'll just do a drive-through, and as we got into it, we realized, well, it's actually not big enough to accommodate all the programmatic requirements on the interior, which also drives the exterior in the site, the drive-through site itself. So at that point, you either have to move on and not take the project, or move on and kind of have a different set of goals in mind. So,
but so it isn't highlighting, as we've talked about many times in the aspects of these courses, it's not a perfectly linear path ever.
It is not.
Like, great, I've got my site, I now guarantee to have my program that fits, and some of it.
Right. And, I'm going to keep on going back to the program, because if you can understand more about your program and kind of the spatial requirements that program requires, it will definitely help you understand what can you really do with the real estate that's in front of you. So, and I would say also from a concept development, store plan, even schematic design standpoint, typically it's an architect, but not always. It could be a designer. So as an example, an organization like Starbucks or Mod Pizza, they have their own in-house design. And so all of that work is actually developed in-house. The architect takes all of that information and develops the construction documents. And the architect is really, it's called the architect of record. And they do the drawings, they do the permitting, they make sure everything's to code. But the design work doesn't necessarily fall within the architect's scope. So, okay, next. Permitting, again, for, that's really the responsibility of the architect, although there are certain things that may not be part of their permitting process, like signage. And sometimes, as we saw in one of the projects that we worked on in DC with a small business owner, the architect was very capable, but their experience was very different than doing a restaurant. Their focus was, I think, primarily on residential, multi-unit, multi-family residential. So pretty big projects, but not restaurant tenant improvement. So it is important when you're selecting an architect. I think that's kind of a question that we're going to ask later, but we'll just kind of cover it now. When selecting an architect or any professional associated with your project, I would really make sure to look at their portfolio of work and understand what their projects are, and ensure that they have like projects similar to what you're trying to develop. Because if they don't know the process, they can skip things that are critical. So again, the health department permit is required for a restaurant, and it's actually required even before you go through the building department process. So it's things like that that can be very critical but overlooked pretty easily. So.
And is that a key one when you think about buildings that are under construction, or you're working jointly with a developer of the rest of the building as a future tenant of it? Is what other, in those cases, do all of these things get duplicated? Are they all done by the building and then also having to be done by the restaurant when they come in, or the store when they come in, or what sometimes falls? Do you need somebody that can comfortably manage their way through all of these things? Or
I mean, an architect, you can have the architect take on that responsibility and provide oversight of the whole kind of permitting process, no matter where it's coming from. And that does help. So that includes engineers, right? The architect can provide oversight of the engineers, even though the engineers are providing their specific scope of work. It still kind of all goes through the architect. And I would recommend it only because then, you as the business owner or developer, you don't have to worry about managing that part of the process, right? So if permitting can happen under the architect, that is helpful. Now, there are certain things that landlords and developers do need to take on or can take on prior to the tenant improvement part of this. And we can actually, I'll talk through a little bit about that on one of the examples too, as far as, what is it from a tenant standpoint that is important to have from the landlord, and what can landlords do to help with that whole process as they're developing their project. So next step is construction. And, that's just kind of managing the milestones and making sure that they're completed on time. Sometimes, the construction company, the general contractor, has their own project manager. Typically they do, but you can also have your own project manager to oversee this whole process, right? Not just the construction part of it, but to make sure everyone is kind of following everything along the process and the right steps are taken. And that's a little bit about what we've been able to do with this commercial affordability project, is just kind of be the owner's representative, essentially, and not necessarily manage the project, but just make sure that things are progressing as planned. So it does, again, help to know the process. And then next after that is operational training. So in restaurants, I think it's really critical, because one of the things that you don't want to do is set the expectations before you open and then not be able to deliver. So I would definitely kind of under promise and over deliver, but I think training is really key in making sure that you know what needs to happen before you actually open the doors to customers. So, and then store opens. So
that operational training has layers of it, even without restaurants, right? I mean, it's sort of,
yeah.
there's a how does the building that you sit in work, and if the if your customer comes back from some common bathroom and it's how do you help? Where are shut off valves if you happen to be the business that's open the latest at night, and many things like that that are key to kind of experiencing a space in a building, right?
Yeah, because to your point, I mean, you could be the landlord, right? And so that kind of operational training and knowing how to deal with these things before you're actually handing keys over to someone is key. Okay. Before we jump into the examples, does anyone have any questions or comments? No? Okay. So I brought two just small examples, but very varied in kind of the scope, just to kind of show how, to your point earlier, Kristen, it's like the process isn't always linear, right? So you kind of have to jump in sometimes wherever you are in that process and just do the best you can. So this one is actually not a new development. This is actually a remodel of an existing restaurant. And it's here in West Seattle. It's a restaurant that actually opened a couple of months prior to COVID. But what happened during COVID, I think part of it is because of COVID, part of it is because West Seattle has become an island. This restaurant has actually been really successful to the point where their online order business is so backed up sometimes that it could be like a 1 to 2 hour wait, right? So the restaurant owner reached out to me to see if there's anything I can do to help with kind of reorganizing their back of house and making it more efficient. So the first step, like I said, on the other thing is the kind of pre-designed programming was really important on this one. And the first step was, what are the goals that you're trying to accomplish with this? And so the goals for this restaurant was, how can we get more product, more food out the door quicker, with the same amount of labor, and also without impacting, to a large degree, the utilities that we have existing. So plumbing, electrical, gas, and then probably the most important thing is the kitchen hood, right? We weren't going to move that. We weren't going to buy a new one. So those were the goals and requirements of this particular project.
Darren,
so,
as a quick aside, will you just talk for why is a hood challenging, or what is it about a hood that makes it something you don't want to move? Can you share that?
Well, yeah, so not just the cost of it, but the hood itself has certain locations within the building where it can actually, because you're venting air from the inside out, right? So how you get that air out is critical, and it's not as critical in a one-story building. It's super critical in a multi-story building. So as you're developing buildings, and this is where the landlord really comes in, and I'll actually talk about that in the next project on this one, because the more the landlord can plan for that to happen the right way, the better it is for the restaurant owner to come into that space. But yeah, it's something that really needs to be thought through well before you take on the project.
Yeah. I didn't mean to interrupt, but I think it's one of those things that for those that hear about it, it's like, well, why is this so critical? And those that don't know about it, it's really important to say, if you're going to do food service, one of your first questions needs to be for your space, can be around, will this work? Can I have a hood? Can it work the way I want it to in a price point?
Yeah, you as a developer know that more than anyone. So once we just kind of talk through what the project goals are on this, the next step for me was really understanding, how does the business actually operate? So this is a very, very simplified version of the hours long conversation that I had with the owner, and just kind of walking through, observing, like, how does this all work? So again, this is a very simplified version of that, but we just kind of identified, how you get food from the back of house to the front. What does that look like? And then from that, it gave us, like, what can we then do to make that more efficient? Again, utilizing the same number of people and not increasing that. So the next slide shows, and actually on the last slide, there was a big blank space. Actually, there you go. That blank space up front is what pre-COVID was seating. So post-COVID, that changed. And that, was the decision the business owner made with this remodel, and saying, you know what, I don't need to focus on seating. I just want to make sure that we get the same quality food out the door faster. So it was really about speed of service. So, certain things you just have to give up. Again, here's an existing space. You're pretty limited on what you can do. So there's decisions that you have to make along the way on, what's important. You got to create this hierarchy of requirements. And so seating became lower on the priority list than everything else. So this shows kind of what we've planned thus far. Now, this design work was just completed a couple months ago, so the work hasn't started yet as far as the actual construction. But you can kind of see, the functions are still there, but it just flows a little bit better, and it's a little bit more stretched out. But it allows a little bit more space for each of the individuals working in those areas to complete their work without actually having to kind of walk too far. Because if you just think about, designing your own home kitchen, there's this thing I talk about, this kind of work triangle, right? Where you go like from sink to oven to refrigerator. So you only want to take a few steps. So you kind of carry that whole idea in a commercial kitchen as well. You minimize the steps and just make it as efficient as possible, and just kind of have that flow go from one end to the other without crossing back and forth or without crossing paths. So this is eventually what we came up with. Again, the construction, I think, is going to start next month. Now, the cool thing for me on this project was, one is I'm hoping that we can actually see gains in sales. So a direct impact on sales from this work, which as a designer, you don't always get that. So I'm hoping that we can actually monitor that and see the impact that the change from a design standpoint will have on sales. The other thing is the architect, or not the architect, the owner of this restaurant is actually a designer. So when I completed the back house layout, I thought my work was done, but then he asked me if I could do the front of house. So that was just kind of bonus for me. So the next slide just kind of shows what the front of house eventually will look like. So that's current. That's what it looks like now. And you can see that blank space was seating. And then what it will look like eventually is this. And then the next slide kind of shows side by side that's existing. And then that's what it will look like, hopefully in a few months. So we'll see. So that is Grillbird Restaurant. And then the next one is Mod Pizza in Pioneer Square. And I don't know how many people are familiar with this, but this is actually in the Weyerhaeuser corporate office building. So fairly new building, I think 2018 maybe was when this was built. And, Mod was really fortunate to be able to take this ground floor space right at the corner. But kind of going back to the conversation about the landlord, this developer was very experienced and very savvy, and they knew they wanted a restaurant space in that ground floor corner. So what they did in the planning of their building actually is ensured that not just, power was there, gas was there, plumbing was provided in certain places for restrooms. But also, to your point, Kristen, the hood and the venting was thought through, because this, you can see, is a multi-story building. So venting had to go all the way up through a shaft that they built specifically for the ducts for the restaurant below, right? So everything was thought through. And that was huge. Because to have to think about that after the fact, once the building is not just done, but occupied, is very costly and time consuming.
And sometimes not possible, right?
And sometimes not possible. Yeah, exactly.
The exhaust requirements mean that it has to be away from openings and operable windows and above suites, and there are lots of things that sometimes there's just not a geometry that can work, right?
Exactly. Yeah, it can prevent the project from moving forward completely. So yeah, so that was a big one. And for that space, again, I think as a tenant, you want to get what's considered, or what's called, a clean vanilla shell, as clean as possible. And you want to get it with all the utilities that you need for the business. So that would be your ideal site, right? And this site, if you kind of go back to that picture, the previous one, this site was, you can see those bottom two shots, was as close to a clean vanilla shell as I think you're ever going to see. So Mod was really lucky, ceiling, floor, operable storefront, and again, all the utilities where we needed it, the amount that we needed. So all Mod had to do was build out the space.
This is actually a really good image. So were you able to leave the floor as the polished concrete?
Yeah.
You have to put in, and then maybe you can talk through sort of looking at, there are sprinkler pipes that go across and a couple lights in there, but what you often, why it's left in that condition as compared to, like, someone might ask, is the sprinkler system all done? Is the lighting all done? Is the cooling all done?
Yeah. So a lot of times, restaurants, businesses, retail, whatever, they like to drop a ceiling in. But so everything can go above the actual ceiling, including the sprinkler system. But with mod, their kind of design language is actually pretty raw. So we just kind of left things where they were. But so, I mean, sprinklers is another thing that can kill a project. So depending on what type of business you have, not everyone is required to have sprinklers. So you may go into a building that doesn't have sprinklers because it's an existing use. You want to change the use, and your use now requires sprinklers. And that's a pretty costly endeavor, because that typically means you're planning something not just for your own space, but typically you're planning it for the whole building. So that kind of help. Okay. So the next slide, and again, I'm just kind of jumping around the process in this one, but this was just the planning process. And this was just establishing, or at least identifying initially, like, what are the goals for the space? What do we want to have in this space? Because the amount of square footage for this was well beyond what is a typical mod restaurant. So there were a lot of things that we wanted to do in that space. And not only was the size of it, but also the location. You know, it's in Pioneer Square. We wanted to establish a presence there and provide different things that maybe in that area you can't find, just as a kind of a meeting gathering space, right? So that was one of the things that we were trying to achieve there. So this just kind of shows what that process looks like.
Darren, can you speak a little bit, and I'm keeping a quick eye on time, but in the context of understanding for folks, like how important it is to get this stage of it right before you keep launching into much deeper design pieces. Like, how many iterations of this did you guys work through? How long of, did this take a week? Was this something that went around for 2 or 3 months, and there are 15 versions of this before you settled on something?
Yes. So this was just one of the very initial ones. And so there were probably, I think I presented maybe 3 different times, but each time I presented at least four different plans, right? And each one actually had all of the different programs within the program, right? Each of those things that are identified here, each one of those layouts had all the exact same programs, but in terms of how it flowed and everything, each one was different. And also, as you go through, because there's no hierarchy here, right? So as you go through each layout, different functions had a different hierarchy depending on what the layout was. So so this one shows a stage, right? Is the stage the most important thing that you want because it takes that front position, or should it be in the back because it's not as critical to the project goal? So it's things like that. But yeah, to your point, Kristen, it's like this is just this is a fairly long process, but at the same time, if you land in the right place, it will make everything go smoother after that. But it is hard because a lot of people in companies like Mod or Starbucks, a lot of people have to come together and come to agreement, which is not, that's typically the harder part of it.
I want you to be able to show the next couple slides, so I'll stop interrupting, but then we'll make sure that there aren't any other questions.
No, so that's just the end result. So the shots of the blank space are kind of the same views as this. So that just kind of shows the end result, and it really is the flagship. So that's all I have.
Yeah. What I don't want to, before they jump into total closeout, and if anybody has questions, please drop them into the chat so we can make sure, even if not now, we can follow up with them. But if you had one parting piece of advice, Darren, your quick tidbit to anybody, what would it be in relation to thinking about store build out?
Well, know your business. Know what it is that you're really trying to accomplish. I think a lot of people, when they get excited about building a business or expanding their business, they sometimes lose sight of what their kind of primary goals are, or even their core businesses. So be far reaching, but also be realistic, right? And also, we had a saying at Starbucks, don't build a church for Easter Sunday, which you may have heard before, which really means, don't try to plan, don't be overly optimistic with what you think you can achieve, and build towards that. Be realistic with what you think you can do. So hopefully that helps.
It's been great to talk to you and to have you share your experience and these images and the thoughts on the process. Does anybody have any questions that they want to throw in before we?
We can go ahead and move it to Caroline to run us through a quick poll, and we can also announce our next couple of lunch and learns. And I think in the meantime, if people have questions, if you want to start dropping them in the chat, we can stick around to help answer them if that works for folks. So Caroline, do you want to jump into we just have a quick 2-question poll.
Yeah, no problem. I'm gonna take over the screen sharing. If you don't mind stopping sharing. Great. So if everyone wants to open up the link I just put in the chat, we just have a super simple poll just to get your feedback as we design future lunch and learns. So if you open up that link, it might ask you to just add your name. You can also skip that, so it can be totally anonymous. But our first question then is, what went well during today's session that you'd like to see more of for future events? You can also text, if you text King County CO 603 to 22333. You can also just add comments in the chat. So a few responses are coming in. Great examples. Tenants, focus. Practical. More emphasis on the examples. That's great. Lots of people liking the examples. Thanks for that, Darren. Great, we'll give folks just a few more seconds to respond. Helpful is rising to the top. Great. And then the next question, sorry, it's taking a second to load. What would you change for next time? So again, the text box should appear on your screen. If you want to just type in your response, it'll populate the word cloud. Great, so we've got some guidance. Well, lots coming in at once. Um, time for questions. Emphasis on other communities, other spaces. Great. Thank you all for your feedback. It's really helpful as we design future lunch and learns and future community development opportunities. So with that, Melissa, I'll pass it back to you just in our remaining minutes to
Great.
upcoming opportunities.
Thank you. And those led, I think, really well into our next couple of lunch and learns. All right, so on August 4th, so just very, very soon, we'll have our next lunch and learn. And I think this will be a great example of a nonprofit community-led development project. We will have folks from the White Center CDA on to talk about the White Center Hub project, which is an affordable housing and community center development project. So they're going to talk about their process of building partnerships and working with community to make sure that community is really centered in their development process. So we're excited to have them. And then on September 1st, our following lunch and learn will have representatives from Alpha Sharp Development Partners, which is a local Black-owned real estate development firm that builds affordable and workforce multifamily housing. And then after that, in October, we will have our asset management workshop, and we'll have dates coming for that soon. So look out in your emails for links to sign up for the next couple of lunch and learns. And Caroline, I know you have another announcement that you wanted to share.
Great. Yes. So COO has two other upcoming events that I wanted to just quickly mention. So the first, I'm just putting a link to in the chat. It's actually tomorrow at noon. It's our next speaker series event. And this event will really be focused on the new economy. So panelists will explore the ways in which local communities are reimagining land ownership in our local economies. So panelists will include Queer the Land, Utopia Washington, and People's Economy Lab. The event will be recorded if you're unable to attend. And then the final event is June 30th. I'm also adding the link in the chat. It'll be from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. And we'll be hosting, it's called Capital Campaigns 101. And really it's emphasizing capital campaign concepts and terms, an overview of the capital campaign timeline, and then exploring some community-centric fundraising principles.
Thank you so much, Caroline. And as I said, I know I'm happy to stick around. Darren, I don't know if you have a few more minutes to stick around if folks want to chat further and have questions. But Caroline, I think you can probably stop recording if you want. And for those that have to jump,